They had been warned that the Americans would violate them, tear away their honor, and treat them as less than human. But when 247 Japanese women stepped onto the pier at San Francisco Bay in October of 1945, the enemy stunned them not with cruelty, but with unexpected gentleness. They had braced themselves for harsh treatment. Instead, they were met with clean outfits, warm meals, and soft-spoken voices. Yet when American soldiers offered them fresh garments, the women declined, lowering their heads in humiliation. 3 quiet words passed through their group: "We are not clean." Their hair, tangled with months of dirt and crawling with lice, made them feel unworthy. They believed they could not accept kindness until someone helped remove the filth that clung to them. If stories like this touch your heart, please press the like button and subscribe. These overlooked moments of World War II are worth remembering. The Pacific conflict had ended 2 months earlier, but for these women, their terror had simply changed form. They had once been nurses, radio workers, office clerks, and translators scattered across Japanese military outposts from Manila to Singapore, from Saipan to the Marshall Islands. When the emperor's voice crackled through the radios declaring surrender, their entire world fell apart. Some had been assigned to isolated islands where their food supply disappeared weeks before the war ended. Others had survived Allied bombing runs, crouching in trenches while the ground shook and the sky glowed red with fire. Now they stood on the deck of a United States Navy transport ship, watching the California coastline rise out of the morning fog. The Golden Gate Bridge appeared like a monument to a world that had endured untouched, while theirs had collapsed into ruin. Some of the women were barely 20 years old, their faces thin, their issued uniforms hanging loosely on bodies that had once been strong. Others were older, long-term military women who had believed deeply in the Empire's ideals until those beliefs crumbled around them. Among them stood Ko, 23 years old, previously a typist at a communications center in the Philippines. Her fingers, once quick across telegraph keys, now shook as she held the ship's railing. Her hair, once smooth and neatly pinned, now hung in knotted strands. She had not washed it properly in 4 months. None of the women had. The ship's engine slowed to silence as tugboats pulled them toward the dock. American sailors walked about with unhurried competence, their uniforms sharp, their faces tanned and healthy. The women watched them with a mix of fear and disbelief. These were the men who had bombed their cities, who had killed their brothers and fathers, who had forced their empire to its knees. Yet they appeared so ordinary, calling out to one another with relaxed laughter, chewing gum and smoking cigarettes. As the gangway was lowered, an American officer stepped forward with a clipboard and a translator. His tone was firm but not unkind as he announced instructions. The women assembled in rows, shuffling slowly, their wooden shoes tapping against the metal surface. Some held small bundles containing the last of their belongings. Others carried nothing at all. The smell greeted them first as they walked down the gangway. Not the thick odor of diesel and seawater that had filled their voyage, but something entirely different. Bread, fresh bread baking somewhere nearby. The scent floated across the bay. For women who had survived on rice balls and dried fish and sometimes nothing at all, the smell was almost overwhelming. Ko's stomach tightened. When had she last tasted bread? Perhaps before the war, which now felt like another lifetime. The dock buzzed with motion. Forklifts moved stacks of supplies, trucks growled past, American voices echoed in English. The words were foreign, but the tone was calm and businesslike. No one seemed to be preparing for punishment or torment. No one appeared angry. The women had been taught that Americans were monsters who showed no mercy. Yet everything before them contradicted those warnings. They were guided onto military buses whose windows were covered with wire mesh. The seats were cushioned, far more comfortable than anything they had sat on in months. As the buses rolled away from the dock, the women stared through the mesh at a city untouched by war. Buildings stood tall and undamaged. Cars filled the streets. People walked along sidewalks carrying shopping bags, pushing baby strollers, and living peaceful lives. A young girl riding a bicycle waved toward their bus. The gesture was so simple and so innocent that several women turned away, unable to process what they felt. Ko leaned her forehead against the cool window. Back home, Tokyo was a wasteland of ashes. Her family's neighborhood had been destroyed in the firebombing raids. She had received a single letter, already weeks old, saying her mother and younger sister had survived but were living in a shelter. The contrast between their suffering and this American plenty made her throat tighten. How had they been defeated so completely by a country that had never tasted such devastation on its own soil? The buses drove for nearly 1 hour before passing through gates marked with signs written in English. Camp Stoneman, the translator announced, a temporary holding area before they were moved to long-term internment. Guard towers rose at intervals, but the soldiers inside them looked bored rather than threatening. The barracks were wooden buildings painted olive green, arranged neatly across a dusty yard. Compared to the shattered shelters many of the women had last slept in, the camp appeared almost orderly. As they stepped off the buses, American servicewomen came forward, members of the Women's Army Corps. This startled the Japanese women. They had not expected to see women wearing uniforms on the American side. The servicewomen were efficient, their faces composed as they led the new arrivals toward a long structure in the center of the camp. Inside, tables were arranged for registration: name, rank, duty station, capture location. The questions were translated carefully and recorded without hurry. Ko answered in a faint voice, her gaze fixed on the ground. When asked about medical concerns, she paused. How could she explain that she felt empty inside, that her body ached from hunger, that her skin itched constantly from lice she could not get rid of? After registration came the announcement that made Ko freeze. They would be taken to the dowsing station, examined by medical staff, and given clean clothing. The words should have offered comfort. Instead, they stirred a crushing wave of humiliation that left Ko lightheaded. The women around her had gone pale. Some began to weep softly. This was the moment they feared most, not pain or cruelty, but being seen in their degraded state. Their unclean bodies would be exposed. In Japanese culture, cleanliness was sacred, a matter of deep personal honor. To be dirty, to be littered with grime, to be unkempt was to feel less than human. And they had no choice but to obey. They could not refuse the Americans' instructions. They could only bear the shame that came with them. The women were guided in groups of 20 toward a large structure made of concrete. Steam drifted up from vents along the roof. As they drew closer, Ko could hear water rushing and could feel thick, humid air slipping out through the doorway. Her hands began to tremble. Beside her, an older woman named Sachiko whispered a small prayer under her breath. The inside was lined with white tile, and the harsh overhead lights made everything look painfully bright. Rows of shower heads covered one wall. Metal bins waited to collect their filthy clothing. And standing there were 3 American women in medical uniforms. These were not soldiers now, but nurses. Their faces were gentle and their movements were soft as they motioned for the women to start undressing. Through the translator, one nurse explained what would happen next. Remove all garments, place them in bags to be burned, step into the shower area for the dowsing treatment, wash thoroughly with the soap provided. Afterward, move to the examination section for a medical check. Then you will receive clean clothing. Her words were simple and matter-of-fact, but for the Japanese women, each instruction cut deep. Ko felt her throat tighten as she took off her jacket, then her shirt, then her undergarments. Around her, the others did the same, moving slowly with their eyes fixed on the floor. Some were crying now, tears sliding down silently. When Ko removed the pins from her filthy hair, clumps detached in her hands. The matted tangles fell across her shoulders, greasy and alive with lice. She could see the insects shifting through the strands. The humiliation crushed her. She wished she could vanish, wished she could stop existing rather than stand exposed in such a state. The American nurses walked among them with a tenderness that felt unreal. They did not pull away or show disgust. Instead, they passed out towels, pointed toward the showers, and spoke in quiet tones that needed little interpretation. One nurse, young with red hair and freckles, met Ko's gaze and offered a small sympathetic smile as if to say that she understood. Ko stepped beneath the shower head. The water came out warm at first, then harder. Steam gathered around her. She reached for the bar of soap on the shelf, a solid white block that smelled fresh and faintly floral. As she washed, the water at her feet turned gray with the dirt pouring off her. She scrubbed until her skin became pink, but her hair remained a battle she could not win. The knots were overwhelming. The lice were too deeply rooted. No amount of soap or water could fix this in a single bathing. She stood beneath the stream, letting the heat pour over her scalp, knowing it would not be enough. Around her, the other women were realizing the same thing. Their hair was beyond simple repair. Months of neglect had created damage that could not be reversed in one cleansing. Some would need their heads shaved. Others would require medicated treatments that would take days or even weeks. When Ko finally shut off the water and wrapped herself in the towel she had been given, she felt cleaner than she had in months. But the improvement was not complete. Her hair still clung together in heavy clumps. She could still feel movement on her scalp. The humiliation had not washed away with the dirt. After drying off, the women entered the examination section. Here, American doctors waited with stethoscopes and blood pressure cuffs. They inspected each woman carefully, searching for signs of tuberculosis, malnutrition, infection, and illness. The doctors worked with a calm and professional touch, yet Ko flinched despite herself. She had not been touched by anyone for so long that even a medical exam felt like a violation. When the doctor looked closely at Ko's hair, his expression became grave. He called one of the nurses over and spoke quietly in English. The nurse nodded and wrote something on her clipboard. Through the translator, they told Ko she required special treatment for the lice infestation. It was severe enough that her hair would need to be cut short and treated with medicated powder. The news struck Ko like a blow. In Japan, a woman's hair was her pride, her beauty, her sense of self. To cut it felt like cutting away part of who she was. During the war, some women had trimmed theirs for practical reasons, but many, especially women of Ko's age, kept theirs long as a tie to their femininity, to normal life, to the version of themselves that existed before the chaos. The doctor, noticing her distress, spoke gently through the translator. He explained that the infestation could spread if left untreated, that it could cause serious infection, and that short hair would grow back healthier and clean. His explanation was reasonable, but reason could not soften the pain of such humiliation. Ko was not the only one. Out of the 247 women, more than 200 had infestations so severe that cutting was necessary. As this truth reached all of them, a shared sorrow settled across the room. They had already lost so much. Their home, their loved ones, their freedom, and now they would lose even this small part of their dignity. After the examinations, the women were taken to another room where stacks of fresh clothing waited. American military surplus dyed a dull gray to mark them as prisoners. Shirts, pants, undergarments, socks, and shoes, all clean, neatly folded, and free of lice or dirt. The Women's Army Corps sergeant in charge motioned for the women to choose their sizes and get dressed, but no one moved. They stood in their towels with wet hair dripping down onto the concrete, staring at the new clothing as if it carried a curse. The sergeant frowned in confusion. She spoke to the translator, who addressed the group. Why were they not putting the clothes on? What was stopping them? Sachiko, the older woman who had prayed earlier, stepped forward. She had once been a nursing supervisor, 41 years old, with gray streaks threading through her tangled hair. She spoke in broken English, then repeated her words in Japanese for the translator to convey. "We cannot," she said. "We are not clean. Our hair is unfit for clean clothing. We would stain the garments. We would spread our impurity." The translator relayed this explanation to the sergeant, who only looked more puzzled. She tried to explain that the clothes were ordinary supplies, nothing ceremonial, and that the women needed to dress so the next step of processing could continue. But Sachiko shook her head, and behind her the other women murmured in agreement. Ko felt herself nodding as well. Yes, this was right. How could they accept clean garments when their hair remained filled with lice? It would feel disrespectful. Even in defeat, even in captivity, they could not abandon all sense of dignity. "We must be fully clean first," Sachiko said. "Truly clean. Our hair must be treated. Only after that can we accept these clothes." The sergeant stared at the group of women who refused to move. In all her months of military duty, she had never seen anything like this. Prisoners who refused clothing, women who believed they were too unclean to get dressed. It made no sense from an American point of view, but the emotion on their faces was unmistakably real. She left to find someone with higher authority. The women waited, still wrapped in towels, water gathering around their feet, their resolve holding strong despite their discomfort. 20 minutes later, the sergeant returned with a captain from the medical corps and a senior officer from the Women's Army Corps. Both women listened as the translator described the situation. The Japanese prisoners would not dress until their hair had been properly treated. They believed it would be disrespectful and unclean to put on fresh clothing while still infested with lice. The captain, a woman in her 30s named Helen Morrison, examined the group of damp, trembling women. She had worked in field hospitals throughout Europe. She had cared for soldiers with frostbite, refugees suffering from typhus, and survivors from concentration camps who were barely alive. But this was different. These were enemy personnel, women who had served in the Imperial Japanese military. By all normal protocol, they should be treated as such. Yet they stood before her, not rebellious or demanding, but ashamed, asking not for comfort but to be clean enough to wear basic clothing with dignity. Captain Morrison made a decision that would spread through the camp and far beyond. She turned to her staff and issued a series of rapid instructions. Bring every available supply of medicated lice treatment. Set up stations with scissors, combs, and anti-parasite powder. Call in off-duty nurses and Women's Army Corps volunteers. They were going to treat the hair of every woman here, all of them today. Within 1 hour, the dowsing station had been completely reorganized. 6 stations were arranged, each with a chair, equipment, and an American woman prepared to assist. The news moved through the camp quickly and volunteers arrived. Nurses, Women's Army Corps clerks, even the wife of a colonel who lived nearby and had heard what was happening. Captain Morrison addressed the Japanese women through the translator. "We understand your concerns about cleanliness. We will help you. Each of you will receive proper treatment for your hair. Some of you will need it cut short. Others may be able to keep more length after the treatment is finished, but we will not proceed until you feel able to accept clean clothing with honor. Is this acceptable? Sachiko's eyes filled with tears. She bowed deeply, and the women behind her did the same. This was not what they had expected, not from their captors, not from anyone. They had prepared themselves for cold efficiency, for harshness, for being processed without care. Instead, these American women were offering them dignity. Ko was sent to the third station where a young nurse named Sarah waited. Sarah appeared to be around 25, her blonde hair pulled into a tidy bun, her uniform still crisp despite the humid room. She smiled at Ko and gestured toward the chair. When Ko sat down, Sarah began to work through her hair with a fine-toothed comb, evaluating the damage. Ko sat stiffly, mortified that this American woman had to touch her filthy hair and witness the lice crawling through it. She wanted to apologize, but the words would not come. Sarah worked with steady, careful motions, her touch gentle even though the task was difficult. She applied the medicated mixture, working it through each section with patience. The smell was strong and chemical, but not unpleasant. As she continued, Sarah hummed a soft tune Ko did not recognize but somehow found calming. After the mixture had been allowed to sit long enough, Sarah rinsed it out, using a pitcher of warm water to gently wash away the treatment. Then came the cutting. Sarah showed Ko the scissors and used her fingers to indicate the length she would need to remove, about 6 inches, leaving Ko's hair just below her ears. It was not as short as Ko had feared. She nodded in agreement. The scissors made quiet snipping sounds. Dark strands dropped to the floor, taking months of suffering with them. With every cut, Ko felt a weight lifting. The burden of the tangled, infested hair, the shame tied to it. When Sarah finished and held up a small mirror, Ko almost did not recognize the reflection. Her hair, though short, was now clean and tidy. Her scalp, visible for the first time in months, showed no movement, no crawling sensation. Sarah added one last treatment of powder to ensure the lice and their eggs were gone. Then she did something that made Ko stop breathing for a moment. She picked up a clean comb and gently arranged the short hair, making it look neat and even a little pretty. It was a tiny gesture, medically unnecessary, but it honored Ko's humanity, her desire to look presentable, her right to dignity. All around the room, similar moments were taking place. American women caring for Japanese women with compassion that crossed borders and uniforms, recognizing their shared humanity. Some of the Japanese women wept, some sat in silent shock, a few, like the woman beside Ko, even managed faint smiles. The process lasted for hours. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, all 247 women had been treated. Some now had very short hair, almost like military styles. Others had kept more length, but all of them were clean, truly clean, for the first time in months. When Captain Morrison returned and asked if they were ready to receive the clean clothing, Sachiko stepped forward again. This time she did not simply bow. She knelt and pressed her forehead to the floor in the most profound gesture of gratitude in Japanese tradition. Behind her, the other women followed, all 247 of them lowering themselves before their captors in thanks. Captain Morrison, clearly moved, asked them to rise. "Please," she said through the translator, "stand up. You do not need to bow to us. Just accept the clothing and get some rest. You have endured enough." The days that followed settled into an unexpected pattern. Each morning, a bell rang at 6 o'clock. The women rose from their bunks, straightened their bedding with the discipline they had learned in military service, and assembled for roll call. The American guards were present but not oppressive. They checked the list, ensured everyone was accounted for, but they did not shout or intimidate. Breakfast was served in a large mess hall. The meals were simple but plentiful: oatmeal with brown sugar, scrambled eggs, toast with butter, and coffee or tea. For women who had survived on a single bowl of rice each day, it felt overwhelming. Ko found herself eating slowly, savoring every bite, unable to fully believe it was real. After breakfast came their work assignments. The women were grouped and given responsibilities throughout the camp. Some worked in the laundry, washing sheets and uniforms. Others assisted in the kitchen, preparing meals under the guidance of American cooks. A group of women with medical backgrounds, including Sachiko, were assigned to help in the camp infirmary. The tasks were manageable and they were given regular breaks. Ko was assigned to the administration building where she sorted mail and organized files. Her typing skills, unused for months, slowly returned. The American clerk overseeing her, a Women's Army Corps corporal named Betty, was patient and even warm. She would bring Ko coffee during breaks and occasionally show her pictures of her family in Ohio. Lunch was served at noon, another filling meal. Sandwiches, soup, and fruit filled their trays. The fruit astonished Ko most of all. Apples, oranges, and sometimes bananas appeared regularly. Fresh fruit had become rare in Japan even before the war ended. Here it was offered every day as if it were ordinary. The afternoons continued with work until 4 o'clock when the women were released to their own time. They could rest in the barracks, read books from the small library in the camp, or gather in the common room where they spoke quietly among themselves. Some wrote letters home, knowing the mail would be censored and might never reach Japan. Others simply sat in silence, trying to process all they had endured. Dinner arrived at 6 o'clock. The evening meal was usually the most filling. Meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread filled their plates. The portions were generous. Ko noticed that she and the others were gaining weight. Their faces were filling out. The sunken appearance of starvation was fading. Some of the younger women even looked healthy again. After dinner, it was time to bathe. The camp had proper showers with hot water. The women could wash as often as they wished. For Ko, the nightly shower became a cherished ritual. She would stand beneath the warm stream, running her fingers through her short hair, still amazed that it was clean and still grateful for what the Americans had done on that first day. 3 weeks into their captivity, the first letters from Japan arrived. Ko's hands trembled as she opened the thin envelope that carried her mother's handwriting. The letter was short, the paper cheap and wrinkled from moisture. Her mother wrote about the struggle to find food. Rice was rationed to almost nothing. Fish was rare. The black market charged prices no one could pay. Ko's younger sister had been working in a factory, but the factory had closed, leaving them without income. "We are surviving," her mother wrote. "That is all we can do. Survive and pray you are safe wherever you are. Please, if you can, send word that you are alive. It would ease my heart." Ko read the letter 3 times, then folded it and pressed it to her chest. The guilt was overwhelming. She had just eaten a dinner of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and apple pie. She had thrown away leftovers because she could not finish them. Meanwhile, her mother and sister were starving. The contrast was unbearable. Similar letters arrived for most of the other women. Stories of hunger, destruction, and despair filled their pages. Some families had lost their homes completely and were living in temporary shelters. Others had lost loved ones to starvation or sickness in the chaotic months after surrender. Reading these letters in a camp that offered 3 meals a day, hot water, and clean beds created a confusion that was hard to describe. The women began to see America differently. On Sundays, they were sometimes allowed to watch approved news reels in the recreation hall. The images showed American cities full of activity, factories producing consumer goods, stores stocked with items, families buying cars and going to movies, living in houses with electricity and running water. The prosperity was overwhelming. Ko remembered what they had been taught during the war, that America was weak, spoiled, and spiritually empty, that American soldiers were cowards who would collapse before Japanese discipline. But now she saw the truth. America had fought a massive war on 2 distant fronts and emerged stronger. Japan, despite its talk of divine destiny and warrior spirit, lay in ruins. The realization unsettled her deeply. Everything she had believed, everything she had been told was wrong. The mental conflict created a pain that went beyond hunger or exhaustion. It was a spiritual ache, a need to understand how they had been misled so completely. Not all interactions with the Americans were official or distant. Small acts of kindness began to appear. Corporal Betty, who supervised Ko, brought her a book one day. It was a collection of photographs showing different regions of America: mountains, beaches, cities, and farmland. Betty pointed to one picture, a small town with a white church and tree-lined streets. "That is my home," she said slowly in simple English Ko partly understood. "Ohio, very beautiful, very peaceful." Ko studied the image. It looked like something from a dream, untouched by war, untouched by grief. She pointed to her own chest and then toward the ground. "Japan," she said, "also beautiful before." She made an exploding gesture with her hands, now broken. Betty's face softened. "I am sorry," she said, and Ko knew she meant it. This American woman, who had every reason to despise the Japanese, was showing genuine sympathy. On another day, Sarah, the nurse who had washed Ko's hair, stopped her in the camp yard. She held a small package wrapped in brown paper. Through gestures and simple words, she made Ko understand that it was a gift. Inside was a comb, a small mirror, and 2 hairpins. "For you," Sarah said with a smile. "Your hair, it grows. Soon you will need these." Ko's eyes filled with tears. The gift was small and practical, but deeply meaningful. Sarah had thought about her, had anticipated her needs, had cared enough to bring it. Ko bowed deeply, unable to find words. When she looked up, Sarah was still smiling, and she reached out to gently squeeze Ko's shoulder before walking away. These small acts continued to appear. A guard who shared a chocolate bar with several women during a break. A cook who taught them how to make American-style cookies and allowed them to help. The camp chaplain, a gentle man, who arranged for a Buddhist priest to visit so the Japanese women could practice their own faith. Each gesture chipped away at the image of Americans as merciless demons. One evening, the women sat together in their barracks and talked about these moments. Sachiko, who had once been a supervisor and was still respected, asked a question many had been thinking but few had voiced. "Why are they kind to us?" she asked. "We were the enemy, we fought against them. Some of them must have lost brothers, husbands, or friends in the war, yet they treat us with dignity. Why?" The women offered different explanations. Maybe it was a tactic to keep them obedient. Maybe it was for propaganda to show the world that America was merciful. Maybe it was simply official procedure, rules they were required to follow. But Ko remembered Sarah's gentle smile, Betty's photograph of home, and the captain who ordered her staff to spend hours washing the hair of enemy prisoners. Those acts had not been tactics or propaganda, they had been simple expressions of kindness, and that was perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. Because if the Americans were simply kind, simply decent people following their own values, what did that mean for the war? What did it mean for the Empire's claims of moral superiority? 2 months into captivity, Ko began keeping a diary. She had found a small notebook in the camp store, a place where prisoners could buy items with credits earned from their work. The notebook was plain, its pages thin, but it gave her space to release the thoughts filling her mind. Her first entry was hesitant. November 15th, 1945, "I do not know what to think anymore. The world I knew has ended. I believed we were fighting for honor, for the emperor, for the survival of our nation. I believed the Americans were cruel invaders who would destroy us. Yet I sit in a warm barracks, my stomach full, my body healthy, treated with more dignity than I expected. How do I reconcile what I was taught with what I now see?" The question consumed her. At night, lying in her bunk, she remembered the propaganda she had believed. The films showing American soldiers as ruthless monsters, the radio broadcasts describing American brutality, the certainty that surrender meant death or worse. All of it had been lies, deliberately constructed lies. She thought about the moment Sarah had washed her hair, the gentleness in those hands, the care shown to someone who should have been hated. Ko had been raised to believe in the superiority of Japanese culture and in the special destiny of the Japanese people. Yet an American woman had shown her more compassion than her own military superiors had shown in the final chaotic months of the war. The conflict in her heart was painful. Her loyalty to Japan was not something she could simply discard. Her identity, her sense of self was tied to being Japanese, but loyalty to what Japan had been, or to what she had been told Japan was. The emperor had been portrayed as divine, the military as undefeatable, the cause as righteous. All of it had collapsed. Where did that leave her? She wrote again in her diary 1 week later. "I am ashamed of how much I enjoy the food here, ashamed that I sleep comfortably while my family suffers, ashamed that I find myself liking some of these American women even though they are the enemy. Is it wrong to feel grateful to them? Is it disloyal to see them as human?" Ko was not the only one wrestling with these thoughts. The barracks at night became a place for quiet, intense conversations. Freed from the rigid hierarchy of military life, the women spoke more openly than they ever had before. They questioned things that had once been unquestionable. One night, a woman named Yuki, who had been a radio operator on Saipan, spoke with bitterness. "We were told to die rather than surrender, to protect our honor through death. I saw women jump from cliffs rather than face American capture. They believed the propaganda, they died believing it. And for what? So they would not have to face the truth that the Americans are not monsters." Her words hung in the air. Other women nodded slowly. They had all heard the same stories. The mass suicides on Saipan and Okinawa, civilians leaping to their deaths, soldiers pulling grenades to kill themselves rather than surrender, all of it driven by fear of American cruelty that had turned out to be false. Sachiko, calm and thoughtful, offered another viewpoint. Perhaps cruelty did exist in some places. War brings out the worst in people, but here we see something different. Maybe the question is not whether Americans are good or bad, but whether any people can be simply one or the other. Maybe we were taught to see the world in black and white when the truth is more complex. But we were not taught that, another woman said. We were taught that Japanese people were superior, that our way was the only honorable way, that everyone else was beneath us. If that was wrong, what else was wrong? The conversation moved into topics that would have been forbidden, even treasonous, before the war ended. They spoke about the military leaders who had led them into ruin, about the propaganda that had shaped their beliefs, about the emperor whose supposed divinity had framed their worldview. Not everyone agreed. Some women still clung to the old beliefs, unwilling or unable to question them. They argued that the kindness they were experiencing was unusual, that America's true nature would eventually show itself. But even in their resistance, doubt had begun to grow. It showed in their eyes and in the unsteady tone of their voices. December brought cold weather to California. The camp provided coats and warmer clothing. This simple act, giving winter gear to prisoners, seemed important to Ko. In the last months of the war, Japanese soldiers had frozen in thin uniforms while their superiors kept the supplies. The contrast was striking. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork in the administration building, Ko noticed a document left on a desk. It was a copy of the Geneva Convention rules about the treatment of prisoners of war. She could not read all of it since much of it was in English, but the parts translated for the camp staff were clear. Prisoners were to be treated humanely, given proper food, shelter, and medical care, protected from violence and humiliation. Ko stared at the document. The Americans were not being kind simply out of personal goodwill, though she believed many of them truly were kind. They were being kind because they obeyed rules. International rules they had agreed to, rules they took seriously. The idea that a nation could restrain itself, could choose to follow laws even when dealing with defeated enemies, was completely foreign to everything she had been taught. Japan had signed the Geneva Convention but had never ratified it. In practice, Japanese forces had treated prisoners however they wished, often with terrible cruelty. The stories of Allied prisoners in Japanese camps were beginning to surface, and they were horrifying. Starvation, torture, medical experiments, and forced labor that continued until death. Ko felt nauseated thinking about it. She thought about Sarah washing her hair, about the hours spent treating all 247 women with care and dignity. That had not been demanded by the Geneva Convention. That had gone beyond simple obedience to rules. That had been genuine human compassion. And she understood something important. America's strength was not only in its factories or its weapons, it was in its systems, in rules that applied to everyone, in the belief that even enemies deserved basic human dignity. Japan had preached honor but had practiced cruelty. America practiced a form of honor that did not require propaganda to support it. That night she wrote in her diary with trembling hands, "I understand now why we lost. It was not only ships and planes. It was that they built a society where people matter, where rules protect even the weak, where kindness is not weakness but strength. We were told that such ideas were Western corruption. We were taught incorrectly about everything." The moment of complete change came in January of 1946, 3 months into their captivity. The camp administration announced that Japanese repatriation would begin soon. Ships were being arranged to take prisoners back to Japan. The news should have brought happiness. Instead, it brought a confusing mix of relief, fear, and unexpected sadness. Ko's first thought was of her mother and sister. She would see them again. She could help them, share whatever money she might earn, be a support instead of a burden. But her next thought was darker. She would be returning to a devastated nation, to hunger, to suffering, to a society emotionally shattered by defeat. And she would be leaving behind the strange safety she had found here. The full meals, the warm showers, the clean clothes, the Americans who had shown her unexpected compassion. The idea of leaving filled her with an emotion she had not expected: grief. On the evening before the first transport was set to leave, the women who were departing held a gathering. They had been allowed to use the recreation hall. Someone had managed to make rice balls using ingredients from the kitchen, a small taste of home. They sat in a circle, sharing memories, preparing themselves for the journey ahead. Sachiko spoke first. "When we arrived here, I thought I was walking to my death. I had heard the stories. I expected cruelty. Instead, I found human beings who treated us better than we deserved. I do not know what this means for the future. I do not know how to tell my family what happened here, but I will carry this with me. It has changed how I see the world." Other women nodded. They shared their own experiences, the small acts of compassion, the realizations that had shaken their beliefs, the guilt of eating well while their families starved, the confusion of feeling gratitude toward the enemy. When Ko's turn came, she spoke softly. "I will never forget the day they washed our hair. I was so ashamed. I felt less than human, but that American nurse, Sarah, treated me with such care. She gave me back my dignity at a time when I thought I had lost it forever. I do not think I can explain to anyone in Japan what that meant. They will not understand, but I will know, and it will shape how I live." The next morning, 150 women, including Sachiko and many others, boarded buses for the first part of their journey home. Ko was not among them. Her transport was planned for 2 weeks later. She stood with the remaining women, watching the buses leave, feeling the weight of the coming change. That afternoon, Sarah found Ko in the yard. The nurse had heard about the departures and wanted to say goodbye before Ko's own turn came. They stood together awkwardly, their limited shared language making conversation difficult, but the emotion clear. Sarah handed Ko a small photograph. It showed Sarah and another nurse standing in front of the dowsing station. On the back, Sarah had written in careful letters to Ko, "Good luck, your friend Sarah." Ko stared at the word friend, such a simple word, such an impossible word given their situation, yet Sarah had written it and Ko believed she meant it. She held the photograph to her chest and bowed deeply. When she rose, tears were running down her face. Sarah reached out and hugged her. It was brief, unofficial, and completely against the rules, but it was real. And in that moment, Ko understood that the war had not been lost only on battlefields. It had been lost in the hearts of people who realized that the enemy was not who they had been told, that humanity was larger than nationality, that kindness was stronger than propaganda. The 2 weeks before Ko's departure passed in a strange haze. She went through her routines, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought constantly about what awaited her in Japan. The destroyed cities, the hunger, the pain of defeat. How would people treat returning prisoners? Would they be seen as survivors or as failures for not dying honorably? She wondered how her mother would react when she saw her daughter healthy, well-fed, and in clean clothing. Would she feel relief, or would she feel bitterness that Ko had lived comfortably while the family struggled? The worry kept Ko awake at night. And there was the question of what she would tell people about her captivity. The truth seemed impossible to explain. If she told them the Americans had been kind, that they had washed her hair gently, that she had made friends with a nurse who gave her a photograph, would anyone believe her? Or would they think she had been influenced by the enemy, that she had cooperated? The safest option would be to say nothing, to hide her experiences, to keep the truth locked away. But the idea felt like a betrayal of Sarah, of Captain Morrison, of all the Americans who had shown her that the enemy was not who she had been told. When Ko's departure day finally came, she was given a small package holding her processed papers, a set of civilian clothing to replace her prisoner uniform, and a small amount of money. The Americans even provided food for the journey, sandwiches and fruit packed in a simple bag. Betty, the corporal who had supervised her in the office, came to say goodbye. She pressed a small gift into Ko's hands. It was a fountain pen, slightly used but in working condition. For writing, Betty said, "Letters, diary, stories, you write well." Ko wanted to explain that her English was still weak, that she had only managed simple filing tasks, that she did not deserve such a gift. But the words refused to come. She could only bow and whisper, "Thank you, thank you." The journey back to Japan lasted 3 weeks. The ship was crowded with returning soldiers and civilians, all heading toward an uncertain future. Ko stayed to herself for the most part, her diary and Sarah's photograph her only companions. She wrote every day, recording her memories while they were still vivid, afraid that time might blur them. When the ship finally entered Tokyo Bay, the sight was heartbreaking. The city that had once been a bright capital was now a wasteland. Entire neighborhoods were gone, replaced with fields of rubble. The few buildings still standing were blackened by fire. People moved through the ruins like shadows, their faces thin, their clothing in shreds. Ko found her mother and sister living in a shelter made from scavenged scraps, one small room shared with 3 other families. The reunion was filled with tears, but it was also strained. Ko looked healthy. Her hair, though short, was clean and tidy. Her clothing was worn but intact. Next to her starving mother and hollow-eyed sister, she looked almost fortunate. "You were fed," her mother said. It was not spoken in anger, but it was not without tension. "The Americans treated you well." "Yes," Ko answered quietly. "They did." She said nothing more. How could she explain? Her mother had survived firebombing and hunger. What would she understand about American nurses washing prisoners' hair? The months and years that followed were hard. Japan struggled to rebuild from the destruction. Food was still scarce. Work was difficult to find. Ko eventually secured a position as a clerk in a small company. Her typing skills remained useful. She spent most of her pay to support her mother and sister. She rarely spoke about her time as a prisoner. When people asked, she gave simple answers. Yes, she had been captured. No, she had not been abused. The Americans had followed the rules of war. That answer usually satisfied their curiosity without revealing the deeper truth. But privately, the experience shaped everything. She kept Sarah's photograph in a small box under her bed, taking it out occasionally to look at it. She kept her diary, adding entries from time to time when memories returned. And she used the pen Betty had given her to write letters, to record thoughts, to stay connected to the person she had become during those 3 months in California. As Japan slowly rebuilt, as the occupation ended and normal life resumed, Ko watched her country change. The old beliefs had vanished. The emperor had renounced his divinity. Democracy was being introduced. American influence spread everywhere, reshaping Japanese life. Some people resisted it, others welcomed it. Ko did neither. She accepted it as the natural result of what she had learned, that the Americans were not the monsters she had been told they were, and that their system, for all its flaws, had something valuable to offer. Years later, when Ko had a daughter of her own, she finally shared the story. Her daughter was 14, asking questions about the war that school lessons did not fully answer. They sat together one evening and Ko brought out her diary and the photograph. "I was a prisoner once," she began, "and the enemy showed me more kindness than I expected. They washed my hair." She told the entire story. the shame of being unclean, the refusal to accept clothes until they could be worn with dignity. The American women who spent hours treating their hair with patient hands, Sarah's smile, Betty's gift, Captain Morrison's choice to honor their dignity even when she had every right to ignore it. Her daughter listened with wide eyes. When Co finished, the girl stayed silent for a moment. Then she asked what happened to Sarah. Did you ever see her again? Co shook her head. No, I never knew her last name. I do not know where she went after the war, but I think of her sometimes. I hope she lived a good life. She deserved that. Why did they do it? Her daughter asked. Why were they kind when they did not have to be? Co considered the question. It was the same question she had asked herself 1,000 times. I think, she said slowly. It is because they believed that even enemies deserve basic humanity, that rules matter, that kindness is not weakness. We were taught something different. We were taught that compassion was soft, that cruelty was strength. But they showed us another way, and that way won the war. And so the act of washing hair became more than a medical task. It became a symbol of everything the war had revealed and everything it had destroyed. For those 247 Japanese women, the moment when American hands gently removed months of dirt and shame became the moment they understood that the world was more complex than propaganda had claimed. They had refused clean clothes because they believed they were too unclean to wear them. But the Americans respected that belief, honored their dignity, and spent hours making them worthy of those simple gray uniforms. It was an act small enough to overlook, yet deep enough to change lives. Co carried that memory for the rest of her life. In her darkest moments, when post-war Japan felt overwhelming, when survival seemed impossible, she remembered Sarah's gentle hands in her hair. She remembered kindness that demanded nothing, kindness that offered no reward, kindness with no purpose other than humanity itself. As she told her daughter that night, decades after the war ended, we expected them to break us with cruelty. Instead, they rebuilt us with kindness, and that kindness was the strongest weapon they had, because it forced us to see them as human. And once you see your enemy as human, you can never hate them the same way again. That is the story worth remembering. Not just the battles or the strategies, but the quiet moments of humanity that survived even in war. The moments when people chose compassion over cruelty, dignity over degradation, kindness over hatred. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These forgotten stories of World War II must be told, shared, and remembered. They remind us that even in the darkest hours of humanity, light can still find a way through. Thank you.